Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I will be your host today. Thanks for joining us on another weekly episode. Honestly, it's been just so fun doing this podcast and getting to pick topics that we think are not only interesting, but relevant to our listeners and our audience. So just thank you so much for all the folks who've been reaching out, letting us know that this podcast has been supportive, meaningful, maybe evoking curiosity. I always say on this podcast that we're probably asking more questions than we are providing answers to. And just really great to have you all here this week. So on this week, we have, I think, a really interesting topic. And as a part of that, we have a guest here with us today. So I'll share a little bit about this guest, who is Steven Huang. Steven maps the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. It's the first Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. That's usually used as an acronym, JEDI, or some people hear the phrase like DEAI. That all kind of falls under the same umbrella. Steven is leading teams across the organization to just address the psychedelic ecosystem's challenges around inequality, as well as the opportunity to provide a format for collective liberation. So Steven has designed and implemented JEDI strategies for organizations across many industries, geographies, and sizes. In the psychedelic space, Steven's focused on bringing psychedelic healing to all, including marginalized communities, while simultaneously honoring the indigenous cultures from where these plant medicines originate. So if you've heard any of my past episodes, you can tell that Steven and I have a lot of crossover interest in some of these categories. Yeah. So on a more personal note, Steven uses psychedelics to better understand one's innate talents, is consistently inspired by the psychedelic community that has paved the way for a queer, Chinese American, gender non-conforming activist to connect with pioneers in the psychedelic space. So thank you so much, Steven, for being here with us. And thank you for your presence and our conversation today.
My pleasure, Jimmy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always happy to be platformed by amazing organizations and people like you.
Thanks. So before we get into our topic today, I'm wondering if you're open to just sharing with the audience a little bit more about yourself, anything that you want to share, whether it's related to psychedelics or not, that can help folks just get to have a little bit more of a sense of who you are.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. There's so much I can share, especially because I just gave a talk on identity where I talked about all my identities. But one of my core primary identities that you didn't address in that bio is that I'm a raver. Love going to raves, love going to music festivals. I used to have to lie about how I got into social justice work. I used to, come up with this thing about how, social justice was always really important to me. But actually the truth is I was on psychedelics. I was at EDC in 2015 and I had like the aha moment of like, this is what diversity and inclusion is. Like, this is what the world is supposed to feel like a deep sense of belonging. And a lot of people tap into their marginalization to like inspire them for social justice change. And I definitely do tap into that. But actually the core piece is like rainbows and smiles and fireworks and glitter.
Yeah.
That is actually like my entry point into this space. That's so important to who I am.
Those are your like alchemical tools, huh? When we're talking about the spiritual toolkit, you're like, it's rainbows and glitter and sparkles.
And cupcake, like yes. Like I have this really idealistic, and I'm of course aware of all of the real systemic racist, transphobic, ableist challenges that exist in our world. But yeah, I tap into my EDC kind of like part of myself.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't want to go too far off in a tangent because I also am a huge proponent of, festival culture and live music culture. I do think, for what it's worth, that live music and psychedelics have a really, really embedded culture just in humanity that probably spans back like hundreds and thousands of years. And at the same time, I really like what you're sharing, because this'll I think add a little bit of context to our conversation, where I find that sometimes like festivals and the music environment is like a microcosm of the human experience, or even like the psychedelic experience, where one of the things that I really like in those environments is there is this permission to just like be as you are and to express yourself
Yeah.
as you are. And that's when you get people dressing up real funky or, so on and so forth, or going to see the music and art that they like. And then at the same time, this is pretty interesting because this came up for me while I was altered this year at a New Year's Eve concert when I saw Closey. I was like, there is also like embedded privilege built into here as well. Like not everybody's able to afford a concert ticket or a festival ticket or take time off of work. And in a way, folks have to pay to be given the permission to go and be themselves. And so anyways, I went on this whole like deep tangent, around
You're like,
that.
I'm not going on a tangent, but
however, let me go on a tangent real quick. On today's episode, we're gonna talk through something that I think we've been alluding to in a couple of different episodes throughout the podcast. And actually, this topic was one of the first ever pieces of information or content that we put up on our website like years ago. We wrote this blog post that was titled "Coming Out of the Psychedelic Closet."
You go.
And so what we're actually going to talk about today is how to tell your psychedelic story. How to tell your psychedelic story, whether you've engaged in psychedelics recreationally or through a therapeutic lens or through a spiritual lens. I think that many folks who come through psychedelic experiences, regardless of whether it's challenging, difficult, scary, meaningful, inspirational, aha moments like you're talking about, I think that there is always this sense of, how do I show back up in community? Like, how do I show back up into my life and into my world? And so also embedded in that, I like that little piece of wording that you gave me, like the collective, approach to some of this stuff. And then also just really acknowledging that telling your psychedelic story is way more nuanced than just giving somebody a play-by-play report of your psychedelic trip or experience and, things like that. So that's what the focus of our conversation will be today: how to tell your psychedelic story, your psychedelic, coming out story. And I'm curious, Steven, if you want to start by maybe sharing with the audience why you think that this is important and, some other things that you're considering as we're framing up this conversation for folks.
Yeah, I didn't know it was the first blog post you wrote. I mean, it was kind of I also got into this space by writing my psychedelic coming out story. And I wish there was a podcast or a resource that I read that kind of prepared me for it, because I just kind of jumped in. So I'm wondering how many of the listeners or watchers right now are where we were a few years ago, saying, I think I'm ready to tell my story. I think I'm ready to, be public, or at least self-disclose to some family or friends or some loved ones about I'm using psychedelics. Your question was, why is it important? And intrinsically, we know it's important because we all want to be living in our truth, right? That's kind of one thing I learned about coming out of my first closet and being gay. I'm like,
sure.
Oh, how much lighter I feel.
Different closet, but still a closet. Yeah.
Still a closet. There are some corollaries that I will get into. But last year in 2023, or maybe it was late 2022, I think it was 2023, the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics did that big polling project. And they polled thousands of registered voters in the US, and they did this big study. And one of the biggest insights and kind of through lines or threads they pulled out from that polling project was how important it was to have a first degree connection to someone who used psychedelics or someone who had used psychedelics. It increased pretty much every measure of acceptance. It increased your ability to trust information that you were getting. And it was just this big lever. It was like it was the lever for how psychedelic acceptance and future policy and laws might be shifted in that more positive direction. And when I saw that stat, it immediately pulled me back to what we know about Harvey Milk and his legacy in San Francisco for gay rights. So, little history lesson, I'll make it short. In 1978, there was a proposition called the Briggs Initiative, who was led by someone named John Briggs. John Briggs was kind of a douche. And he wanted to make it illegal for gay people to be teachers. And so the Briggs Initiative would have made the mandatory firing of all gay teachers, and all people that supported gay rights could not be teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to pass, which was like, it was not that long ago, 1978. And so Harvey Milk said, okay, he gave this big speech in the summer of 78. Everyone needs to come out of the closet. People need to understand that if this law passed, who it would be impacting.
I see.
And when he encouraged hundreds of thousands of people to come out, and later that year, the Briggs Initiative did not pass by a somewhat slim margin, but it showed the power of people knowing that psychedelic advocates and psychedelic users exist in the world. And I think that's going to be really important for acceptance and policy change.
That's really fascinating. And I first and foremost wholeheartedly agree. And I want to highlight a couple of things that have come into some of my conversations. And I think that an element of what you're talking about as you're sharing about, Harvey Milk's legacy is that it's very easy to relegate things that affect our society and our culture as like the other, as like, this just affects this bucket of folks over here, those crazy psychedelic users and explorers. But if it's your mom or your cousin or your coworker or your friend or your sister, then that changes everything, because you're like, oh, there's actually a human behind, all of these things. And, I also think that what you're bringing up is a really important aspect of not only like personal freedom, expression, and liberation that we're touching upon a little bit here, but also about how do we create bridges of accessibility to folks. And I'm reminded of a story. I was asking my friend DeAndre, he lives back in Atlanta, and I was like, why is it that the Black community is so averse to psychedelics? And of course, there's obviously like straightforward things that we could point to: the war on drugs, incarceration of people for nonviolent drug offenses, and things like that. But the one really poignant thing that he said was that it's not like we have an uncle or a cousin or something who can come back and say, hey, I actually had a positive psychedelic experience, and this is how it's affected my life. And so I think folks from all different types of backgrounds have different starting places with this within their cultures and families and communities and things. But that's pretty interesting what you're saying about like what Harvey Milk did was to say, hey, actually, let's actually show them who the real folks who are impacted here, which then created what I would imagine, hopefully, the starting of like normalizing culture, into this space.
It was definitely an inflection point. And, one thing that you talked about earlier, you mentioned when we were talking about like your privilege of having this closey ticket, you have to be pretty privileged in America to have access to psychedelics.
Definitely.
Culturally, you have to like have the safety to feel like you can take psychedelics. You have to have access to something that might be illegal where you live. You might need to have access to information to know how to test that in the right way, to make sure it's safe and to feel safe taking it. And I want to say that coming out requires you to use your privilege to extend that safety to someone else, right? That like, oh, okay, it's safer for me to take it because people like Steven and Jimmy are using their privilege and talking about it, normalizes it for people like me. And I think that's another thing that, Harvey Milk was assassinated 2 weeks after that law passed.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Like it came at quite a personal cost for him to do that, and if you're scared, if you're like, I don't really want to give up my privilege, I like being able to use psychedelics, for myself. And I don't care if other people are scared to use it or don't have access to it. Like just check in a little bit. And, no, I'm not saying everyone has to come out of the psychedelic closet, but you can position it, if you have privilege, to think about it might be, I don't know, I felt a sense of obligation. In my coming out story, I talked about my sense of privilege, and I want to create access for people that look like me and that have identities like me to be able to have the same access to healing that I've had. So I'm taking on myself to create a path for that, for them, by telling my story.
And it takes a bold person to be able to put that into words and to be able to articulate that in a way where you are talking about it, pretty directly. I think in that first blog post that we wrote, a lot of what we were sharing, this actually shows how entrenched into our modern society's way of thinking about psychedelics, where a lot of what I was sharing about why you should share your story or come out of the psychedelic closet was about the harm that it causes to you internally if you like keep this under wraps or keep it a secret or have this big shifting experience and have nobody to share it with and nobody to, and I know that was the case in my own personal life, where I would have these big profound experiences, have no processing, no integration, so I was forgetting all of this stuff in months anyways, but then I felt like, oh, like I gotta bottle this up and keep this inside, which then ended up ricocheting and creating like a lot more other issues. So I really like your approach and framing around, hey, this is actually not just about the individual. Yes, there's a component to that. But what I really hear you saying, I really like that word, that obligation. Yeah, if I could touch on a personal moment, really quickly, I was just sharing the story that like one of the main reasons why I am so vocal about my own psychedelic work and all of that is because I had a best friend take his life when I was in high school. And a lot of times when I would sit and have my psychedelic experiences, one thread that always came up was like, fuck, I wonder if things would be different if my friend also had access to this too. And so when I hear you speaking about like that word obligation, I think that's really powerful. I also think that there's almost like this sense of duty and responsibility, for me to do that. So thanks for sharing that. And we're talking a lot about why this is important. And as always on this podcast, we want to talk about tangible, actionable things, a lot of the how and the other, things to consider. So before we jump into that, I wonder, Steven, are there any other things you want to share with the audience around like why is this important or anything that's coming up for you right now?
We'll get into it. I just also, I also want to pause and tell people like you have to think about it first. like listen to don't end the podcast now and go telling everyone, like finish the podcast because we're going to talk about how and like what you have to watch out for and things to consider.
Yeah, really good input. We always tell people like after psychedelic experiences, don't go rushing to make a whole bunch of big life decisions. And I also think what you're highlighting is that sharing your psychedelic story publicly is a deeply personal process and a deeply personal choice. And what I always share with my clients afterwards is just like, you have a right and a sovereignty of, being really selective on who you share with, how you share, what you share. A really interesting phenomenon that comes up really frequently with my clients, and I would imagine clients in our facilitator referral network, is like this pressure. They're like, oh, how am I going to go back and explain this to my daughter or wife or something, or almost the drain that can take when you're in, let's say, a psychedelic experience or processing and integration. Then you're like, oh, now I got to package this up in some type of way that makes sense for other people to hear, when I don't even know if this makes sense to me right now. You know what I mean? So
yes.
I wonder, what are some other things that are important to talk about when we're thinking about some of these more like how aspects around sharing your story?
Okay, well, what you just brought up is making me think about also when someone tells you their story, you can't tell their story to someone else without their permission. Like if I'm telling you like my story, Jimmy, like I expect you to respect that I told you. And I also want to control or have sovereignty about who you tell and how you tell it and when you tell it and how you tell it. Right. So there's a sense of it's
consent.
Well, consent. It's kind of like someone's medical record too. Like if someone tells you they have like, a chronic disease, you can't just go around telling everyone. Sure. Like it is private information until it's made public.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think one of the first things that in our like little meetup before this was we were talking about this aspect of like, okay, how do you frame up your narrative? And maybe we could chat about that a little bit. And I was kind of alluding before, maybe it's not like a play-by-play on all of the sequence of events that happen, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, about like what's important to consider when somebody is thinking about the narrative of their psychedelic experience. I will also caveat to say
Yes.
that we humans are always trying to find meaning in things, and we're always trying to package up stories, which means that there's a lot of stuff that can hit the proverbial cutting room floor when we're trying to address the narratives of our psychedelic experiences. And so I do want to caution folks a little bit that we are talking about this in the framing of like, how do I have a meaningful conversation with another human around my psychedelic experience, and not so much about like unpacking, processing, like that whole like integration aspect.
Okay, so I think it depends on if you're having first a one-on-one conversation with someone, or if you are writing a blog post, or in my instance, I was writing a LinkedIn post, which was, I don't know, maybe not what I would recommend for most people. But it just consider, who is your audience first, and what do they know? What are they aware of? So if you're having a one-on-one conversation, I might ask, make sure they're in a place to receive, make sure you're not like, you're both sitting down and having this conversation. And you might want to ask them, especially if they're hesitant or if they maybe have stigma, like a lot of people do around psychedelics, to say, hey, what do you know about psychedelics? What do you know first, and kind of understand where they're at. That might help you orient how you want to share your information, because your story should be curated to how you want the person to receive it and who they are. And then a helpful framing, I know this is a lot, a helpful framing that actually my friend Marisa Sturts gave me.
I love Marisa. She's
You
great.
love Marisa?
Yeah. Met
Marisa,
her
I hope you're
recently at
listening.
Burning Man, and really, really solid human. So,
Marisa's like a psychedelic storyteller. She's like helped so many people tell their stories. So if you don't know Marisa Sturts, look her up. I love that you know Marisa. It's a small world. She uses this framing of, who were you before? What was your experience? And who are you after this psychedelic experience? So that way you're not dwelling on like the trip report, like I saw this and then this happened, but it's like, hey, here's who I was before. Here was the experience that I had, and here's who I was after the experience. And when you can communicate and articulate that transformation, that's inherently what people are connecting to. A lot of us are looking for growth and change and development to become better humans. And if you can portray that, it helps people understand, oh, this thing wasn't this thing that made you lose your mind. It was actually something that really helped you in some really meaningful way.
I think thank you for sharing that. I'm really soaking that in on almost this conversational setup of like, tuning into who you're talking to in your audience. And what I also hear is just being really thoughtful around like the environment in which you're chatting, which I do feel like inherent in sharing psychedelic stories. You're likely sharing things of like a personal and maybe vulnerable nature. So oftentimes this is better suited in maybe more private environments, or or what I find, what I have to check myself on all the time is when I start sharing in a public, let's say a social environment or something like that, and then I realize, oh, this is actually not the right environment for me, so I gotta like kind of like course correct or like adjust there. And I really do like what you're saying about what Marisa is framing up for us. And what comes up for me, and maybe this is a question and kind of picking your thoughts here, is that one of the things that I try to look out for when I'm sharing my psychedelic story is how much am I packaging this up into something like performative, meaning like, here's who I am before, and then this thing happened, and then here's who I am now, and it almost like oversimplifies this process to where it feels like just straight up like cause and effect, right? Like you did this, and then you did that, and then now it's this. And then also I think about folks who share their stories a lot. So if you get to a place where you're fortunate enough to have 50 conversations with folks, then it does kind of become a little performative. And I think one of the downsides of that is it has the potential of stripping out that like sacredness of the experience, maybe. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what I'm kind of challenging here.
I hadn't thought about that before, to be honest. And I've had to share my experiences a lot.
Hmm.
actually. Or I've had the opportunity to, I've opted into that. Has it taken away the sacredness of the experience? No, yes and no. I think for me, a beauty and strength that comes from what came up for me, at least in an ayahuasca ceremony, I hadn't been able to talk about for 30 years.
Hmm.
So now I can talk about it.
Ah.
And the more I can talk about it, the more I'm like, I owned like that thing that I was so anxious about has no more control over me. And it's empowering. So maybe it's case dependent, but there are some things that, probably do lose its magic. Maybe that's just a personal, it's up to the individual.
What comes up for me as I'm hearing you, Chad, is that like a lot of this is probably dependent on why you're choosing to share your psychedelic
Mm,
experience. And if
mhm.
you're, wanting to share your experience to have like an exciting dinner table conversation, likely a little bit different than your intention of like, hey, I want to connect with my sister more by telling
Yeah,
her
yeah,
about
yeah,
how
yeah.
meaningful these experiences are for me. So maybe
Yeah.
that's a good tangible piece of advice for folks, is to really check in with your why that you want to share, and that might be a good place to start there.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because if you're like at a dinner party and like, oh, Jimmy, come over here and
Tell
tell
us that
Sally your exit
story.
story.
Tell
You're
us that
like,
thing that you did, and you're like, "Whoa, I'm not here, to do a parlor trick for you." You know what I mean?
yes, that's a good. Yeah, if anyone actually asked me to tell my story, like perform your story for me.
I think the other thing that's coming up is likely you need to have just some sense of trust with the person that you're sharing your story and your experience with. And you were talking a little bit about being really thoughtful of how you're framing it up and what you're sharing. And I think how much you share probably depends on the trust and the depth of that relationship that you have. I think that it is, in a weird way, more straightforward to share with a loved one or a friend or a family member or something. But we are now approaching an environment in our society and culture where people are just talking about psychedelics. So like this is going to show up in
Yep,
workplace conversations or
yep,
the random person you meet at the grocery store or whatnot. And so I
yep.
wonder I wonder if you have any thoughts on what I'm bringing up here, that this person might not be somebody who's like really close in your life, and you may be in an environment of sharing your experience.
Yeah, it happened. I was in an Uber, and I live in San Francisco, so we were passing by some unhoused folks, and this person was like, "Oh man, the drug crisis in the city, it's so bad." And he had a lot of misconceptions around drugs, and he had immigrated recently from somewhere, and I was like, do I need to like step in like as my drug policy reformer
Am I
activist?
the one
Like,
that's
I'm
being
just trying
called
to
up
go
for
through the
service
air.
right now? Or do I
Yeah.
get to go to where I'm going?
And I was like, is this a test? Is there a camera? Is my boss watching me? And it was hard to have, like, I didn't, like, is this the right time? Am I the right person to deliver this message? Does he want to hear it from me? All those kind of questions were in my mind.
Did you end up choosing to share something with that Uber driver?
No,
Yeah.
I opted not to.
Hmm.
And in hindsight, should I not have, I didn't have the energy for it at that moment.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you went through your own internal process that is like juggling all of these different things that we're talking about. Do I have an obligation or a sense of duty as a person who positively benefited from psychedelics to share this? What's my personal energy and bandwidth, currently? How deep is my relationship to this person? Is it a stranger or somebody that I know? So it's pretty, I think it's pretty cool that you like went through that in
I
live
went through
time
it.
very, very recently. And
Yeah.
one of
Yeah.
the things that I like that you shared in like previous conversations is that, this aspect of what we're talking about, which is like choosing your audience and being really mindful of who you're sharing with. And nowadays it's going to be a boss, a coworker, or something like that.
Mm,
And I
mm,
also will share that, psychedelics are not in a fully legal place right now. So I also share with folks to like
mhm.
think about your own risk exposure or risk tolerance. Some of us are just private folks in general. Some others are maybe a little bit more extroverted and like wanting to share. So I just want to like highlight that, a little bit as well. So, when we're talking about this whole piece about maybe some more conversation around the how to share your psychedelic experience. Wondering if there's other things that come to mind for you that would be helpful for our audience to hear.
Yeah, you're touching on it right now is not everyone has the safety to be able to do that. And now we're kind of getting into the specifics of it, right? If you work with kids, if you are a medical professional, if you live in a place where psychedelics are not legal or not as accepted, depending on your circumstances and who you're telling, just like any psychedelic experience, there are risks involved. I think if you were a nurse and you were telling folks that you were, microdosing on a somewhat regular basis, that might actually jeopardize your career. I have a friend who disclosed that he tried to microdose before a board meeting to deal with a lot of the racism that he was experiencing. Ended up taking a little bit of a mini dose versus a microdose. And then years later was, in my opinion, wrongfully terminated because of his drug use.
That was pretty publicly out there. And so I remember reading up on that, and it's really challenging because I think that what you're highlighting with your friend is that these risks do exist no matter how privileged of a seat you're in.
He's a CEO of a $1 billion company.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, if he was a white guy, maybe things might have been different. It's my thinking of it. But you have to be aware of who you are and who you're telling before you do that.
I think psychedelics in general are honestly really relational. I mean, one of the aspects that I really appreciate about psychedelics is that it really does cause you to, in different formats, in different ways, like question stuff, whether it's questioning your identity or questioning how you're living your life or questioning the strength and of your relationships. I think that there is inherently this like questioning aspect that comes up in psychedelic experiences. And I do believe that then extends as somewhat of a useful tool post experience. So in the context of this conversation, it's like questioning, like, what are my risks here of sharing with this person? Why is it that I feel motivated or not motivated of sharing with this specific person or group? What is my intention of wanting to share? Is the sharing for me to just have a platform and an audience to share my story? Or is it sharing because there's something relevant that I want to like relay or express to like this individual? I also think like, what's your agenda here is kind of like what I'm getting at. Like if you're approaching from this place of like, I got to convince this person who's listening to me that psychedelics are great and everything's awesome and that they should try it and whatnot, way, way different tone than, a conversation where you're not trying to convince somebody of anything particularly. And so, I acknowledge we're getting down towards the end of our episode. I know that a lot of this had been influenced by some of your work in what you were telling me about, like the psychedelic coming out series or something that you had been working on. And then also just wonder if there are other like important things that you want to share with the audience around this topic.
Yeah, there's this, I wish we had more time. There's this kind of thread that I want to pull on that's coming up around like why are you telling it? Is it for you or is it for them? And there's something around if you're cherry picking parts of the story because you have an agenda that you want to get across, I don't think that's inherently a bad thing, but it might be something to check in on, right? Like if you are telling someone a story because you want them to try psychedelics, maybe sit and examine that motivation. If I'm trying to convince you, Jimmy, for some reason, why is that? Is it about me or is it am I trying to help you or am I trying to like make myself feel better about my drug use? Like I'm wondering, examine your motivations, and especially if you would catch yourself skipping over some of the difficult things. If you're only telling the positive spin, be like, check in with yourself. Like, why am I only telling the positive sides of the story? Why am I glossing over some of the hard work or the difficult experiences that come with this process?
Yeah, and it's likely probably a mix of like probably a spectrum of different reasons, of which I'm not going to oversimplify to say that there are ultimately good reasons and another bucket and category of poor or like bad or lesser than reasons. I think that we are very nuanced and dynamic humans, and I think having that little bit of self inquiry before you're choosing to share and what you're sharing and how you're sharing, I think is really powerful. For example, you may have a really innocent desire just to have a little bit of recognition for the hard work
Mhm.
that you've been
Mhm.
doing in a psychedelic experience, or
Mhm.
the psychedelic experience might have been so meaningful that you just have this burning urge and desire to what what somebody was sharing with me, one of my clients who's given me permission to share his story publicly, to proselytize, like go and
Yeah.
like knock on doors and be like, have you heard about psychedelics and how they can like that type of stuff. I'm obviously joking here a little
Yeah.
bit, but
Yeah.
I think it actually really is so important to check in with your own motivations and reasons, and I think that exercise in itself will probably help you to determine, okay, what language am I going to use here? What
Mm.
things am I going to highlight and
Mhm.
focus on here? And
Mhm.
then also the other part is that sharing psychedelic stories can also be deeply cathartic. And I
Mhm.
also know that it does help with this sense of like normalizing or a sense of belonging. I think another thing that many folks may feel coming out and sharing through psychedelic experiences is this feeling of maybe being like not normal or ostracized or like feeling a little bit separate from other folks, and I think that psychedelics can be a really cool bridge to some of that as well.
Mm. Mhm.
It's been really great, Stephen, to get to chat with you and get to, just pick your brain and, just
Always.
some of these things. I think that this is, a really important topic, probably a topic that likely everybody runs into if you've been through a psychedelic experience or really any type of potentially life, changing experience. And, we're just humans that we'll go through experiences, and then when we look back, we just create the story or that limited narrative or that, whatever about it. And so I hope that our conversation today has really helped folks just have some things to consider, some things to think about. He really hear you in just expressing a little bit of thoughtfulness around this before
Yeah.
you just
A
go
lot of
start going
thoughtfulness.
out and blabbing and sharing your story. Anything else you want to leave the audience with as we wrap up our episode here today?
No, I will say, I think I alluded to this in the very beginning, is I did my psychedelic coming out story on LinkedIn, which
Yeah.
was a bold choice that happened to be the social media that I use. So, if anyone is thinking about doing that, I think there are really interesting ways on how to do that well. Please message me. I will tell you everything I learned about coming out psychedelic on LinkedIn.
I actually have something that I want to ask you now that I'm
Yeah.
thinking about this. Do you have any input, advice, or guidance on folks who may be sharing their psychedelic stories, but they're receiving like criticism or judgment, or like you just know that it's not like a healthy environment in which they're doing it, but they're already kind of like in it? Like maybe you're sharing with somebody who you think that you trusted, who you thought, okay, this is a safe space to share, but then as you're sharing, you just kind of maybe pick up on some things where you're like, oh, like this is getting unhealthy really quick. I'm wondering if you could chat on that a little bit or have any thoughts
Oh,
on that.
oh, oh, that's rough. That's a tough question.
Yeah. I leave the hard ones for last. So
Man, this wasn't in the prep doc.
yeah.
Um, hmm, that'd be really hard. That would be really hard. Like, my first thought is like, oh, like, stay strong, like, stay true, but that's just like kind of like empty advice in some
Sure.
sense. Like,
Sure.
like if someone's like not getting the response that they were hoping for, I don't think it's helpful advice to be like, oh, like contact someone that is supportive. Because what if you don't have a support network? What if
Hmm.
you are the only person and there's no one in your community or network that you feel like you can tell safely?
Well, with the last part that you brought up, I actually find that there's a lot of interesting power in sharing your story with people that you don't know very well. Kind of like, I'm not saying like a stranger on the street, but there is this aspect, there's a term for this about like people are actually more willing to disclose personal things about themselves to folks who aren't fixtures in their lives. And then there usually is a little bit more discretion and censorship with the people in your life. And that kind of makes sense because you want folks to think about you in a certain way, or you want to maintain a relationship, here and there. And so I do, want to put a signal out to folks that if you are one of these people who don't feel like you have somebody, or don't feel like you have community, or don't feel like you have somebody to share with, the power of strangers on the internet is actually like pretty big, meaning like join a meetup group, or join a integration group, or reach out to organizations that are literally designed for this. And I think that in itself, that community aspect is very I think has a lot of healing potential behind it. I think the effect of psychedelics is like you do want to go out and find other folks who have been through something relatively similar, so that you can share with that. And as I was posing you that really hard question, I was thinking like, oh man, how would I respond to that? And I guess the one thing that I want to share with folks is that you have a responsibility to your own feelings and emotions, and not the feelings of emotions of other people. And so oftentimes I feel that folks who share a story, and maybe it's like getting a little uncomfortable, or maybe the person you notice is putting a lot of judgment. Oh, you should have done this, or why didn't you do that? Or that's not how I think about drugs, and things like that. You have your full autonomy and sovereignty to stop the conversation. And I think that many times people continue on in those conversations out of nicety, out of politeness, out of like, hey, I don't want this to be socially awkward. But I will tell you, I was literally just talking to somebody earlier about this today, that there's a cost to that. There's a cost to your own emotional well-being, and your own sense of safety, and your own sense of, protection, your own sense of freedom, if you end up sharing these stories with folks who ultimately aren't equipped to have a meaningful dialogue and exchange with you about it. And so, my heart was feeling a little tender as I was posing that question and seeing your response. You're like, damn, that's really hard for somebody to go through. And I just want to share that, like, this is a call for empowerment. Like, you got to take the reins back and be like, hey, like, actually, I'm actually not. That's all that I actually have to share about that. Or yeah, I thought that I was in a place where I wanted to share, but now that I'm realizing, and sharing, I'm realizing that I'm not as cohesive in what I want to share. So maybe this is a time to revisit. The number one thing I tell to my clients is like some phrasing for immediately post a psychedelic experience is like, if somebody asks you about it, we've been talking a little bit about like how we're going to plan and intentionally tell somebody, but there's also kind of these impromptu things where folks ask us, and then on the fly we're like, what am I gonna say? So what I share is like, hey, I'm still processing that experience, or hey, that experience is really still significant or really sacred or meaningful for me. So when I have the ability to share, know that I will, but that's just not the right time, right now also. So well, thank you so much, Steven, for being here on this podcast. That wraps up our episode for today. Before we end, I do want to share a testimonial that was brought in by an individual who went through a consultation call with our concierge team. They said, which I'm really proud of our team for this one. I found your team and organization to be so well put together, thorough, and a place that people like myself can come to and trust when making a big decision to move forward with a journey. And I think that our whole conversation kind of had that theme and thread through it about like finding environments where you can have a pathway of trust with an individual. And I think that just goes so far in not only sharing your psychedelic story and all of that, but also I think as a really powerful tool towards your own healing and liberation and exploring your identity, whatever that might mean for you. So thank you to everybody who listened here. You can find our podcast episodes really anywhere you find podcasts, primarily Apple podcasts and Spotify. We also post videos up on YouTube as well. And we really look forward to seeing you all next week. And thank you so much to Steven for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.